The first speaker, James Kirchick, he is a visiting fellow at the Center on the United States at the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution in Washington, which is a prominent think tank in Washington. He has worked as a journalist for different media, and he is now a regular contributor to publications like the Washington Post and Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany. In 2017, he published a book which is called The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age, which is a bleak title. So, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kate, for the invitation. Thank you all for having me here. Thank you for giving me 5 more minutes than the rest of my panelists. I will use it well. So I published a book 2 years ago called The End of Europe, and its title is not a reference to the dissolution of the European Union, although this is a remote, although not impossible, possibility, but rather something more ethereal and imaginable, which is the slow, gradual reversion of Europe to the state of nature prior to the era of integration that took place after World War II, and the rise in its place of a group of states that are basically, amoral in terms of their foreign policy, that are prostrate, that are nationalist in their orientation, and that no longer project the liberal values upon which the Euro-Atlantic community, the transatlantic community, has been grounded, and that are willing and in fact eager to engage in purely transactional relationship with Moscow. And just at the moment when the West requires unity, it is disintegrating. Brexit foretells the potential demise of the European Union, the slow unraveling of the European Union, which has been a democratic bulwark to Russia's predatory strategy of divide and conquer. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, in my country, the Trump administration presents a new paradigm of unpredictability. If I were to write a sequel to my book, I would call it The Scramble for Europe. And what I mean by this is that rather than being a security exporter, which is what we all thought Europe would be in the 1990s, we all recall the slogan, out of area or out of business, we're now seeing Europe itself becoming once again a region, a zone of geopolitical competition. And the prime external threat, the prime external player in this geopolitical competition is Russia. Now, unlike during the Cold War, Russia does not seek the military domination of Europe through the advance of the Red Army. It's not occupying countries, although it is occupying some countries. It's not going to occupy, all the way up to the Rhine, and it's not spreading a Marxist-Leninist ideology, but rather what it seeks to do is reset the continent's security order. And the Kremlin tries to achieve this through meddling in European and American politics so as to sow dissent, to sow confusion, and to install governments that are acquiescent to the Kremlin's primary objective, which is supplanting the values-driven, rules-based international system with what Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has called a, quote, post-Western world order, wherein might makes right. And in this order, the countries along Russia's periphery will be forced to accept limited sovereignty. In the words of the analyst Dumitru Minzarari, if the old types of war aim to conquer territory in order to gain control over the citizens, Russia's new type of warfare aims to conquer the citizens in order to achieve control over the territory. I think it's a very sort of succinct way of understanding what it is Russia is trying to do. Moscow is seeking nothing less than the reversal of the momentous historical processes that began 30 years ago in 1989, when Central and Eastern Europeans peacefully reclaimed their freedom after decades of Russian-imposed tyranny. Now, because the European Union and NATO are obstacles in this reassertion of Russian hegemony, Moscow's long-term strategy is to undermine and ultimately break these institutions from within, thereby neutralizing the concert of democratic nations that has traditionally been necessary to restrain Russian expansion on the European landmass. The Kremlin's ideal outcome, and pardon to the Finns in the audience, is the Finlandization of the West, the entire West, whereby Europe and America abandon their principles, sacrifice their allies, and accommodate Kremlin prerogatives without Russia having to dispatch a single soldier abroad. In Western Europe today, and in America, I would say, Russia hopes to achieve by non-violent means what the Soviet Union once did in Eastern Europe through force of arms, which is overthrow democratic governments. For a West that is divided, inert, and unsure of its own basic values is not one that will resist Russia's revisionist agenda. Across the Western world, Russia is pushing on open doors, exploiting fears over Islam, economic inertia, and anxieties that are wrought by globalization to nudge Western publics in a more Russia-sympathetic direction. Finally attuned to the particular grievances of a diverse array of Western constituencies, Russian narratives about all these complex topics, they find fertile ground in Europe and in the United States, where resentment over the Iraq War, the fallout from the financial crisis of 2008, fears over terrorism, and revelations of National Security Agency surveillance continue to breed discontent with the political establishment. Unfortunately, beginning with President Trump, many Western leaders have difficulty accepting the strategic necessity of treating this current Russian regime like the pariah that it is. They continue to labor under the illusion that it is our own hubris or our arrogant post-Cold War imposition of security and political arrangements on an emasculated post-Soviet Russia and its neighbors that is primarily standing in the way of good relations. You often hear that it is NATO expansion that is the reason why we're having all these problems with Russia. It's the reason why the Russians felt the need to, they were provoked into annexing the Crimean Peninsula. This credulity extends, I should add, to the previous American administration, which awoke to the problem of Russia very late. There are also, I don't need to name them all, but there are a fair number of European political elites. A certain former German chancellor comes to mind, who are stuck in a mindset that still considers Russia to be a potential partner, and who bend over backwards to explain Russian conduct as the predictable and not entirely unjustified reaction of an encircled power, you hear that word all the time, whose interests must be respected. They counsel us to bend our own rules, our own values, in order to basically appease the claims of a revisionist power that wants to overturn this order completely. To paraphrase a certain Russian revolutionary, the West may not seek conflict with Russia, but Russia seeks conflict with the West. This is because the Putin regime cannot coexist alongside a democratic Europe that is willing to stand for its principles. Mr. Putin sees liberal democracy as a threat and therefore must defeat it, either by force of arms in Ukraine, an attempted coup in Montenegro, or through nonviolent means in the West, disinformation, corruption, buying off various politicians, you name it. Whereas once Russia was allied with local communist parties and the far left across the Western world, now, in a strange sort of reversal, it finds itself allying often with those on the right. I think the avatar of the Kremlin-friendly conservative is the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who over the last quarter century has undergone one of the more remarkable transformations in European politics, from that of a liberal anti-communist firebrand to Vladimir Putin's closest ally in the European Union. Despite being the leader of a proud nation that was brutally invaded and occupied by the Soviet Union, Orban today is the most vocal internal opponent of EU sanctions placed on Russia over its meddling in Ukraine, which is a neighbor of Hungary. Orban also aligns with the Kremlin on more profound levels, championing what he calls his form of illiberal democracy. He's called for ethnic homogeneity in Hungary, as well as echoing Russian narratives on Western decline and the threat posed to Europe from the Islamic peril. He's also, you may have seen last week, he was quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying he wants Hungary to be neutral like Austria. No offense to the Austrians, but Hungary is a member of NATO and is not supposed to be neutral in these matters. One of the more potent narratives that Russia has weaponized in this regard is that of a Judeo-Christian civilization which is under siege from a rising Islamic threat. As fears of demographic and societal change have taken hold in parts of Europe that have been traditionally the most resistant to Russian meddling, like Central and Eastern Europe, given their history, Russia has subtly insinuated itself into Western political dynamics to an unprecedented extent, finding allies in the unlikeliest of places. That said, just because the issue of Islamic immigration, Islam in Europe, just because it has been exploited by Russia does not mean that it should prevent us from having honest conversations about the challenges posed by this. And I think this is going to lead me to my next point, having to do with this whole phenomenon that we call populism, which is a very broad term. There was a poll commissioned that came out about 2 years ago by Chatham House, which found that over half of the respondents in 8 out of 10 European countries, so this is the majority of Europeans, favor an outright ban on immigration from Muslim countries, which is the exact same position that Donald Trump took during his campaign to be president of the United States. And everyone in the media and sort of polite society rose up and said this was horrible, it was fascist. And you can think whatever you want about this viewpoint, but it's one that most Europeans, according to Chatham House, happen to share. This means, I think, that the gap between those who make the policies on issues like immigration, assimilation, integration, this gap needs to be narrowed between the political elites and the public that they represent. Because I fear that if it is not narrowed, then what we will see is the continued rise of this whole assortment of parties that we're all familiar with, the National Front in France, Geert Wilders, the Sweden Democrats next door, the Alternative for Germany. I think we need to disentangle the debate and the question of immigration in general with the broader conversation that we're having with this question of democratic decline. I think too often we say that those who want to restrict immigration are not democratic, when in fact actually they're probably more democratic than their adversaries. And I don't think, whatever your views on immigration are, I don't think that having a view in favor of a more restrictionist immigration policy necessarily makes you an illiberal. The reason why I personally have a problem with Viktor Orban is not because of his views on immigration, it's because he's going after the free press, it's because he's eliminating checks and balances, it's because he wants to turn his country into an illiberal democracy. And I think what he's done very cleverly is that he's been able to use the issue of immigration to basically distract everyone in Europe from those real serious assaults, kicking the Central European University out of Budapest, which is, to my mind, the most egregious thing he's done. I mean, that's a totally Soviet-style tactic. But he's been able to use this issue of immigration, which is a real issue that people have real concerns about. And he's been able to basically distract us from the real genuine assaults on liberal democracy. I fear that we may be misdiagnosing the rise of these populist parties. I think a lot of it, I think most of it has to do with the issue of immigration. I think if the issue of immigration becomes less of a fear, if it becomes less of a political issue, if there's some sort of consensus reached on it, I think you will see the decline of these parties. I think Sweden, and you're all probably familiar with it being next door, I think Sweden is the most obvious example of this, where for years they had a immigration policy that was not supported by their public. You could see polls going for years where almost half the country wanted to severely limit immigration. And no one was willing to tackle that problem except this one party called the Sweden Democrats, which also happens to be founded by former neo-Nazis and opposes NATO and is anti-American and is pro-Russian and all these bad things. And because they've been able to seize this, issue, I think most people voting for the Sweden Democrats probably don't care much about NATO. They want to limit immigration, but unfortunately, you get all the other baggage that these parties represent when they come into power. In response to Brexit, the election in the United States, the rise of these populists, many in the West are beginning to question the assumptions upon which the post-war liberal order stands. And I think while clearly we need to ask ourselves questions, like I've been trying to do on the issue of immigration, I don't think we need to rethink the security architecture, which a lot of people want us to do. I think NATO remains the bedrock of our security, no matter how many times certain individuals call it obsolete. I think the post-war, as an American, I think the post-war international system that we have basically constructed with our allies and partners has been wonderful for America. It's allowed us to become the richest, most powerful country on earth. It's not a burden. It doesn't cost too much. It's actually a pretty good deal. So all these, but that said, the retrenchment of the United States, perhaps it's unclear, it's only 2 years into the Trump administration, the revanchism of Russia, the entry of China now into Europe as a geopolitical player. We're all seeing, this is basically ending, I think, this period, or potentially ending this period of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And I want to echo what my colleague Andrew Mikta said before. I think all this talk about strategic autonomy is irresponsible. To have the German foreign minister say that he wants Europe to form a counterweight to the United States is, well, first of all, I think it's not possible. Second of all, I think it's just very premature. I'm getting the 2-minute sign, so I think I'm just going to, I'll just end it there, and I'll wait for the next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A lot of food for thought and reasons for questions, I think, from the audience.